have a special guest, Associate Professor of Cornell University, Emin Gün. Thank you to keep time for us, and how are you today?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing very well and very much looking forward to chatting with you about blockchains.
Satoshi Nakamoto published white paper of Bitcoin, and he mentioned about proof of work like 10 years ago. At that time, and even 5 or 7 years later, majority of people were not interested in it and how it works. But nowadays things have changed so much, and even the smallest investor tries to investigate as much as possible. But for example, white papers are usually fully technical, and sometimes it's really hard to understand them. So can you explain in really simple words and without too much of complicated technical terms what is Avalanche and how is it going to influence or affect our lives in near future?
Sure, very happy to do so. So just to provide some additional context, the core problem at the heart of any cryptocurrency, any blockchain, is that of keeping a bunch of distributed machines in consensus. That is, we will have a number of machines, potentially a very large number of machines. They will need to decide who has how much money, who owns which token, who owns which stock, what signature got placed on the blockchain, et cetera, what assets got transferred. This requires that everybody agrees. So we don't want a situation where you think I paid you, but somebody else thinks I did not, because then you won't be able to spend that money with that person. So that process is called consensus, ensuring that everybody is in sync. And this is a much harder problem than it seems on the surface. It's not just a problem of, well, you tell everyone. Most people think of it as, oh, I just broadcast it. I just tell everybody. Well, what happens when there's what we call a Byzantine actor, somebody who is malicious, who's duplicitous, who's trying to manipulate others, who says two different things. He says one thing to you and something to other people. Those are the cases that get complicated and things have to be decided by the consensus protocol. That process of decision is very complex. So this problem has been studied for about 40, 50 years by now. And in those years, there emerged two families of solutions. One that I call classical consensus. This was pioneered by people like Leslie Lamport, Barbara Liskov, and others, who both actually happen to have Turing Awards. So this is a fundamental aspect of computer science. This process of making decisions is at the core of so many other things we do. That's one of the most important algorithms that we deploy. And classical consensus protocols are very famous, are very well studied, and they're at the heart of every private permissioned blockchain. So anytime you hear of a company issuing coins on a private blockchain, they are typically using one of those algorithms. These algorithms are very rigid. They require that everybody know who's in the system. So for example, you and I want to make sure that a crowded restaurant, everybody at a crowded restaurant prefers the same color, red or blue. I want everybody to have red in their hands. This is a bit of a difficult thing to do, right? So if you employ a classical consensus protocol, you will end up having to know everybody in the room. And that's what makes them difficult to deploy at large. So if you want to have a system like Bitcoin, and the initial step is everybody must declare who they are and everybody must agree who all is in the system, it's a non-starter. So the brilliance of Satoshi Nakamoto was that he came up with the second family of solutions, and for which he's amply rewarded. He gets a lot of credit. He has about $10 billion to his name. And the second family of protocols works very differently. He says, look, you don't need any of the classical complications. You don't need to identify who you are. You and I don't need to know everybody in the restaurant. What we need to do is have this process called mining that is at the heart of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And what is that process? Essentially, anybody can come into the restaurant. I don't need to know who anyone is or what they're doing. As long as they somehow solve a puzzle, they get the right to declare what color we should all have. Okay, so in essence, he has a lottery protocol, or in essence, he has a leader election protocol. I don't want to get too technical with the terms, but what he is doing with his brilliant protocol is solving this process. By means of these crypto puzzles. So by means of electing a miner who then decides for everyone. So these two protocols are great. Both sets, both families are wonderful, but they both have drawbacks. The Nakamoto family is fantastic in every way, except it consumes an enormous amount of energy. Mining is an arms race. If you mine at some particular rate, I want to mine faster than you. We start racing, and we end up executing, and we end up consuming enormous amounts of energy, and that causes centralization at places like Shenzhen in China, where electricity is cheaper. Further, there's a pretty big problem with latency in Nakamoto protocols. It takes 10 minutes for a Bitcoin transaction to be confirmed, and you cannot wait for 10 minutes at a coffee store trying to buy coffee. This is the famous coffee example that Bitcoiners often talk about. And of course, at the end of the day, the throughput is also limited to about 3 transactions per second. So if I go on the flip side, if I look at classical protocols, they're architecturally not suited. So they're not even a good start because we need to know everybody. There's a consortium. There's some kind of a validator set that we have to agree upon. And that's very difficult to obtain. In addition to that, they typically are quadratic in their communications. Everybody must communicate with everyone else. So if you're in this restaurant and people could lie to you, they can be Byzantine. Well, then what do you have to do? I can't rely on your word for what your co-host Kerem said, because you could lie to me about what Kerem said. And people from Turkey, I think your audience might be predominantly Turkish, will know quite a bit about Byzantine history, right? So Byzantine emperors did all sorts of things to ascend to the throne. Nothing is beneath them, right? There were mothers selling out their sons and so forth. So it's a pretty brutal world out there, and those protocols to sort of work around the brutality, they incur a lot of overhead. Now, finally, we come to the third family. So the Avalanche family is completely different, and it combines the best, in my opinion, of these two systems, of these two families. It is quick to achieve finality. It has high throughput. It scales well to large numbers, and it's what we call a quiescent protocol. It does not require an arms race. It does not require energy expenditure at rest. So the network will make a decision when there's a decision to be made, and on occasion, when there's nothing to be done, it can sit back and not consume any energy at all. Now, of course, everything has a drawback, and I'm happy to describe the drawbacks of the Avalanche protocol as well. But I think it's engineered in such a way that the drawbacks come out only in the worst of circumstances, and they affect only the bad actors in the system. So I think it's quite cute the way the trade-offs got moved around. You can't possibly make something fantastic out of this situation. There's always some badness, but you can massage where that badness goes. And in the case of Avalanche, that badness has been pushed into the case of conflicting transactions. If somebody is lying to you, if somebody is trying to spend the same cash with you and me, so that is they're trying to defraud one of us, then in those cases the protocol might actually put them at a disadvantage, and that's perfectly fine. They should not be doing that in the first place.
May you tell us a little bit of your story? How did it start, and how did you get involved into Avalanche?
So I've been working on consensus protocols for a long time. So in fact, I've been involved in cryptocurrencies for a very, very long time. I designed the first implemented proof of work currency in 2002, 2003. So that's 6 years before Satoshi, I was doing proof of work. But let's see. So then I left that area for a little bit. Then I came back when Bitcoin started getting big, and I looked into the security of Nakamoto consensus. And after that, I looked into how to scale Nakamoto consensus. That is, how can we get higher throughputs? And we came up with a protocol called Bitcoin NG. And since then, I've been looking at different aspects of this puzzle. In particular, I've been looking at how to make coin holdings more secure, and many others, how to build secure smart contracts, and a bunch of other things. So how to make the network layer go fast. And I can go on and on. But so overall, my group has been at the forefront of the cryptocurrency revolution. Now, the question here is Avalanche. For about 2 years, I've been thinking about the core idea behind Avalanche. And we've been thinking about how to build a system that is much lighter weight than classical, much, 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 much more sustainable, much more green than Nakamoto. And so we were working on this problem, and we received a manuscript from a team that calls itself TeamRocket. And TeamRocket has a very interesting solution and a very interesting analysis for this problem.
Well, you're an active Twitter user, and there are some people who are criticizing Avalanche on Twitter. So, would you like to make any statement to answer them?
Which, I mean, anytime you do anything at all, if it's important, there will be somebody getting ready to criticize you. And if you have any stature, there will always be somebody who's going to pick a fight with you to try to raise their own stature. So I don't know what to say or do about these cases. I've come to expect a large number of trolls on Twitter, so I'm not sure what you're referring to. But I can respond to sort of the standard, the two standard arguments that I've heard about Avalanche. And so I'll do it on the fly. This is not a proper formal response, but just to give everybody an intuition about what's going on. So Avalanche, I think, is groundbreaking work. The internets, when they discuss stuff, they will go off into funny directions sometimes, and I can't be out there to fight every misconception. But one of the things that came out, I believe, in the Hacker News discussion is, what do you do about the Sybil problem? Right? What happens if somebody wants to participate in the network, but they don't just come in as, for example, you, Kristina, they come in as Kristina 1, Kristina 2, Kristina a million. And now it's just like that restaurant, except the evil person in the room isn't just one of her, there are a million of her. And now she can completely overpower all the honest players. She can completely take over the system. So that sounds like a valid criticism, or that's something to be concerned about. So let me take a step back and try to educate people on how these things work. So Sybil deterrence fundamentally can only be done by constraining people by some resource. Okay, a very simple way to do Sybil deterrence is to say, show me your ID, and then that way I can make sure that you can't masquerade, by anything other than one person. A more complicated way to do it is to say, how about you solve a puzzle? I give you a proof of work puzzle, and then you use your CPU to solve a puzzle. So, and there are many other techniques of this kind. These techniques are outside the realm of the consensus protocol. A consensus protocol cannot do much about the Sybils. In particular, Nakamoto doesn't do much about Sybils. So the first three miners in Bitcoin, they could all be the same miner, and no one would know. So people get a little confused about this point. They think that Nakamoto solves the Sybil problem because they don't understand the difference between the consensus protocol and the sort of the Sybil deterrence layer. Those two are decoupled, but Nakamoto complicates them, confounds them into the same thing. So they're different. Okay, back to this case at hand. So we come to a system where we would like to deploy Avalanche, and you can deploy Avalanche using any Sybil deterrence mechanism you like. Do you like proof of work? You can still use proof of work. I happen to not like proof of work. I do like it because until recently, I thought it was the best thing we had. But it consumes a lot of energy. So my preferred deployment would be to stake. That is, for you to participate in the system, you have to purchase and put down, let's say, 1,000 Ava coins. And if you don't have 1,000 Ava coins, well, then you don't get to have an identity. And that's a very simple way to ensure that Kristina cannot suddenly turn herself into a million Kristinas unless she has a billion Ava. And so that's a simple deployment scenario that I happen to like. But as I said, the Sybil deterrence mechanism is outside the protocol. It's the core consensus mechanism that we really care about. So when we actually go to build a coin around this protocol, then we need to specify the Sybil deterrence mechanism. So another issue that has been brought up is asynchrony. So in academic work, it's considered great if your system is asynchronous. That is, what does that mean? That means that messages may take infinitely long. Or put differently, the system will work well even when it's partitioned. That is, I have a restaurant and something happens and there's a line through a wall erected in the middle of the restaurant so that the people on the left cannot talk to the people on the right. And I still want everybody to have the same color. That's a very hard thing to achieve. And what other protocols do is when in a situation like this, they simply ensure that the majority side of the wall will achieve the same color and the minority side will shut down safely. So that's that work. Avalanche in its current form is not asynchronous, but we believe it can be extended to be asynchronous. Avalanche in its current form has proofs that are for a synchronous network, and we expect that work to also be extended to a partially synchronous network. The difference between, well, I don't want to get into the technicalities between partially synchronous and synchronous at the moment, but there are gradations of properties you want. And so as written, Avalanche is not asynchronous. In fact, it is synchronous. It's the simplest of these three models. And I fully expect that the core idea will be extended to cover all three of these bases. It's not very hard to extend it to cover even the asynchrony case. So, but that's future work. So one thing at a time. And I think the paper would be absolutely, explosive if we could pack everything into it. And so as it is, it's just it's as long as it is, right? So.
On the summit, you mentioned that in a month or so you are going to release new coin called Avalanche. So what surprises are awaiting us?
What surprises are awaiting us? So the main thing that we're working on, the thing that we're trying to pack into this new upcoming paper is essentially all of the dynamics. How should the coin work? How do we mint the coin? How do we give it out? How do we ensure that it's decentralized? What else do we build on top? And one of the most exciting features of this coin is going to be its natural governance model. The way Avalanche works is, unlike these other protocols, it works by constantly polling the audience and steering the correct nodes, the good nodes, towards the same outcome. And that process lends itself to governance really well. By governance, I mean the process of making decisions about the protocol itself. And in many cases, especially in monetary systems, you have to do this. Now, what do you have to do? For example, a set of nodes engaged in some cryptocurrency might decide to mint currency at a different rate. They might decide, okay, the currency is being printed at too fast a rate. There is not enough demand. We need to crank down the rate at which it's being generated. Or vice versa. We need more nodes, and why don't we give more rewards to people who stake coins and stay in the system? So they might want to turn this knob that is all too critical. It's the same knob that is controlled by central bankers today, right? So some technocrat in a room someplace in cahoots with a whole bunch of politicians decides how our money should be valued. In Turkey itself, as you know, the lira is being devalued tremendously at the moment. We have no control over this as ordinary citizens. But in the Avalanche world, you do have a say. You get to determine what inflation rate is acceptable to you. And the system will find that midpoint, if there is a midpoint that is acceptable to the vast majority of people. So this is an interesting thing to have. It is so unlike everything else that came before it. Let me give you some examples about how it's different. Bitcoin has this idea of a fixed deflationary currency. It mints coins according to a set schedule, and that schedule is not going to change. The social consensus around it is too strong, and it's just going to mint according to this very set. Currently it's 12 and a half Bitcoins every 10 minutes are printed and issued. That's nice, but it completely ignores the rate at which people demand Bitcoin. Sometimes a huge number of people come in and demand is sky high and the price goes through the roof, which is nice. But then there is no demand at times, and there is a glut of coins, and then suddenly you have too much and the price tanks. So that needs to be controlled, or that can be controlled if people wish to do so. Ethereum ends up minting coins according to a 2% inflation rate. And I don't know that that's correct either. My economist colleagues tell me that it's better than a deflationary currency. But is it really sound? Is it really good? It all depends on what's happening in the external world. And it's very difficult to bring information from the external world into the blockchain. And that's what we can do with this new coin. So I'm really excited about the Avalanche coin.
Well, thank you again for your time. These are all my questions for today. It was really nice to meet you and to talk to you. I wish you great success in your professional career and all your future endeavors.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.